Chapter 6, Part 3, For Whom the Bell Tolls. Having seen Giorgio and Maria off, the 5 traveling companions turned to the main reason for their stop in Venice, retrieving one of the legs of the Sedefkar Simulacrum. They stopped for a quick coffee in the Santa Lucia Stazione, collecting themselves beneath a ceiling stained by coal smoke and winter damp. The cups were small and the bitterness did little to steady their hands. They reviewed what they knew. The leg had traveled to Venice during the Napoleonic campaigns, birthing unrest and violence as it went. A French soldier had interred it in the Basilica of San Marco, only for a member of the famed Gremanci family, Italian doll makers, to unearth it 2 centuries later. They had less than a day before the Orient Express would whisk them away. Less than a day to find the damnable leg. Noticing a few black-shirt patrols sloping along the platforms, the investigators promptly swallowed their drinks and vanished into the narrow lanes, heading toward the Campo dello Bambino. According to Leopold's discovery, this was where the Gremanci family had lived for centuries. The cold gnawed through their overcoats, the city's breath smelled of sewage, smoke, and the brackish lagoon. From the distance rose the clamor of riots, shouting, whistles, and the rattle of nightsticks. Giovanni asked a passerby if they were on the right path to the Campo. The Venetian, with that indifferent courtesy peculiar to those who live in perpetual tourism, shrugged and said, "Always straight, you can't miss it." They wove through the city's stony arteries, over bridges slicked by mist. The conspiratorial light of January thinned across the water as they came at last to a square that seemed forgotten by the gilded age around it. Campo dello Bambino was out of step with the rest of Venice's sumptuous plazas. Its heart was a grimy cafe that survived on habit, a shop that pushed maps to the lost, and buildings that sagged under the weight of students' laughter and stale laundry. Factories breathed sharp, unsavory odors, and in the open cold, a company of war-scarred veterans lingered. Many bore prosthetic limbs, their eyes were remote, their hands trembled as they bummed cigarettes from passing students and tourists. All along the square, the veterans formed a patient queue toward a little villa wedged between a factory and a church. The villa carried a placard with tired pride, Gremanci Factory. The 5 walked the length of the line, the murmuring veterans paid them no mind. The chill settled into their bones. They entered the villa. The air was dry with wood dust and glue. The foyer was large in the Venetian way, long and high, with brittle plaster and paint sinking from eggshell to the dirty white of neglect. A few youngsters played cards at a creaking table. The queue slipped through to the next room like a brown tide. Dr. Marsh cleared his throat.
Does anyone speak English here?
A veteran turned, raised a hand, and hobbled toward him with a soft whir of leather straps. Marsh's questions were simple, rehearsed politeness. The soldier answered with a sudden spark. They had all, he said, won a regional lottery ticket. The prize, a wooden prosthesis, fitted free of charge by Antonio and Sebastiano Gremanci.
They do not take any compensation for these prostheses?
Asked Claudia. The veteran's eyes gentled. Number. Antonio and Sebastiano were doing God's work, he said, and rejoined his comrades with the helpless pride of the helped. They drew together, the investigators, speaking low.
I cannot believe that they would do this free of charge,
Sighed Claudia.
Has it occurred to all of you that they might be just good Samaritans?
Spelled out Giovanni.
I hope that it is charity, but the last few days have been harrowing. I would rather we stay on our guard,
Retorted Rose. The house told its own story. The Gremanci might be a powerful name, but the rooms were not rich. Cracks veined the walls, little pocks of missing plaster showed the masonry beneath. The paint curled like old paper. It was a place where money went out and did not come back. They passed into the next room, where the queue paused before a small desk. A bespectacled, rotund receptionist, her pencil hovering over a ledger, collected names and addresses. Seeing strangers, she nodded them forward. Marsh, with practiced meekness, explained that he was a doctor and a veteran and terribly interested in the construction of prostheses. She brightened. They were in luck, she said. Antonio Gremanci would take a break shortly, and they could speak to him after the current patient. While they waited, the group drifted, curiosity tugging them in different directions. Leopold stepped out into the back courtyard, shadowed by Rose, who slipped her hand into his and squeezed once.
Steady, don't go far.
A large workshop opened behind the villa. A truck idled near a loading door, while apprentices collars up against the cold, loaded crates of dolls. The dolls' faces, swaddled and stacked, seemed oddly solemn as they went into darkness. They entered the workshop. 2 rows of hand-operated sewing machines and lathes filled the space, and 6 elderly workers moved with a measured patience that gave the room a heartbeat. They attached limbs, set eyes, stitched soft torsos. They looked up to nod at Rose and Leopold, then bowed again to their tasks. Finished dolls stood in ranks along the walls, beside prosthetic limbs and mannequin parts. Cold, glassy blue eyes were scattered everywhere. Spares in saucers rose on shelves. They were motionless and yet somehow watchful. It took very little imagination to believe the eyes were tracking one's movement with a soft, grating slide. Beyond a door in a corner, the air turned kiln hot. Ceramic heads and limbs waited for firing. Bolts of pale cloth and piles of stuffing lay stacked in lazy towers. 3 younger men worked here, silent in their concentration. At a cramped desk sat a pale man with long black hair, writing neat little reports in a tidy hand. Back at the receptionist's office, the others were ushered into a small examination room, the sort with an auscultation table and a smell of soap that never quite cleans the smell of fear. An older man greeted them, Antonio, they presumed, his thick glasses magnifying his eyes into the faceted look of a fly. The man spoke no English. Giovanni slipped into translation with easy charm. The questions were cautious, the answers were ordinary. The work was wood, mostly. No, they had not used blue ceramics, not for prostheses. The old man squinted, then drew back with a small, startled exclamation. They were Americans. His voice rose as he called, "Sebastiano!" The shout carried through doors and walls. Out in the workshop, Rose and Leopold paused. The pale man behind the desk looked up, composed his papers, and crossed the room with an economical limp. Sebastiano replaced Antonio with a quiet courtesy that made room for language. He understood they were interested in prostheses and offered them a tour. As he guided them past saws and vices and racks of limbs, the others, reunited with Rose and Leopold, fell in behind like a small parade. It was then they noticed the limp, a modest falter in the left step. Claudia, blunt with worry, said,
I don't mean to be rude.
And asked why he limped. Sebastiano's mouth tilted, amusement or pain hard to tell. This is from the Great War. Marsh's voice was softer. He, too, was a veteran. Sebastiano nodded. Monte Grappa, he said, and lit a cigarette with hands that trembled only when the flame went out. He led them back to the small room, massaging his leg, the rhythm of a man who knows which places hurt. The cough came on him suddenly and savagely, and he pressed a kerchief to his mouth with an old soldier's embarrassment. Claudia noticed then what he did not hide. The leg was wood. He confessed with a thin smile that the cigarette helped with gas poisoning and showed her the mechanism by which he walked. He folded himself into a chair. Now that they had seen the family operation, how could he help?
We thought the family was a doll-making company. Are prostheses a new endeavor?
We've always done prostheses, he explained. Since the war, dolls no longer paid the bills. He had lost his father in that same war. It broke his grandfather. When Sebastiano came home, the old man had refused to profit from pain. He built prostheses for free. The whole north of Italy came. There were donations, yes, but the truth bled from the walls. They spent far more than they took in. Sebastiano helped his grandfather because family and debt were old synonyms in Venice. Giovanni leaned forward, voice pitched to admiration.
What you're doing is commendable. We have actually come with a different request. Someone stole from the church. We found a note in the Basilica San Marco.
Sebastiano plucked the paper from Giovanni's hand and blanched, as if seeing a ghost in daylight. Goodness, he murmured. That, unmistakably, was his great-grandfather's hand. He left to fetch Antonio without waiting to excuse himself, and the investigators followed like filings to a magnet. Antonio flushed with embarrassment at the implication. It was typical of Papa Marco, he admitted with visible reluctance, to poke his nose where it did not belong. My great-grandfather stole a statue's leg from the church. Sebastiano's voice thinned to incredulity, and beneath that, resignation. There are things you learn about your family only by hearing them out loud. Claudia asked plainly, did they have blue leg made of ceramic? Did they craft something ages ago that would look like a blue left leg? A statue of lifelike size? Sebastiano made them climb to a dim upper room where archives slept in dust. Drawer by drawer, box by box, a life unspooled in ledgers and notes. Everyone searched. If there was a clue about a blue leg made of ceramic or a statue, it would be there. Giovanni's fingers, blessed by fortune, found the relevant tangle. A black market ledger, cash scraped from things done in alleys. Notes on scarcity, on buying wood when wood could not be bought. On selling dolls when dolls would not sell. And threaded through, the private log of Marco Gremanci, a single line marking that Palazzo Rezzoniani's clock tower had been struck by lightning. He must check on his friends. Afterwards, he complained, his left leg had started to fail him. Soon after, Signor Rezzoniani died. The arithmetic of a life bent toward charity was stark on the pages of the Gremancis' ledgers. Antonio and Sebastiano were killing their business to keep all this moving.
What is in the Palazzo's clock tower?
Claudia asked. Automatons, Sebastiano said, though he was not sure. He sketched directions to the palazzo with the ease of a man who knew his city. There would be an old caretaker there, nonno fidele. They should speak to him. The Palazzo Rezzoniani lifted from the Grand Canal like an old soldier shouldering his coat. A splendid 15th century thing in warm burnt orange, its ducal-style gallery curled in Gothic arches. Equilateral crosses nested in circular frames like secrets in a rosary. 3 stories rose in measured grace, and behind them an inward-facing bell tower that only the family could see, an intimacy turned to stone. Children swarmed the visitors at the landing, eyes bright, hands quick. From a ground-floor window, an old man brandished a broom and scolded the flock into dispersal. He was thin and tough as cord, nonno fidele, and his gaze weighed everything. Claudia explained, as smooth as need allowed, that they were to examine the clock tower. He barked a laugh, stepping outside in a limp. The tower was off limits, dangerous, the railing barely held.
What happened to your leg?
Claudia asked, as if remarking on the weather. Bothering me for several years, he grunted and named his price. He could give a tour of the whole place, 5 liras, but no tower. The garden was raw with winter. Claudia sank to a bench with a gasp. She turned into a credible fake cough. Rose stayed with her. The others let Fidele lead them through rooms of drifted dust and shuttered light. Outside, a gale gathered and set the canal to churning. The day dimmed to pewter. When the wind was at its worst, Rose and Claudia walked to the base of the clock tower. A heavy new lock glared from the door. The stone was damp, the metal cold enough to nip fingertips. She knelt and set her picks. The lock answered, not with a click but with a vindictive bang. It shattered outward and smacked her cheekbone with a bright bruising kiss. The upside, the door was now unlocked. The downside, the ruckus boomed through the courtyard like a drum. Inside the palazzo, Fidele started and peered about. Giovanni muttered,
Must have been the wind.
With practiced innocence, the others agreed. The phrase skittered along the halls and somehow passed for truth. They swept through the rooms, tapestries weeping their dyes, wooden floors that saw more feet in memory than in life. On the 3rd floor, a velvet cord barred off the family apartments, death's modesty. Fidele tapped the cord with 2 fingers, glanced at the ceiling, then at their faces. The room where the last of the Rezzoniani had died, he said. Did they still want to see? The room opened onto the campanile. A window stood unlatched. Frost crept along the sill like a cauterized wound. The air smelled faintly, unmistakably, of a cadaver. Somewhere within the walls, the clock's gearing counted time with the blind certainty of machines. Fidele's nerve failed. He muttered about the children outside and shuffled off. Marsh said,
I would feel more secure if you stayed with us.
The old man crossed his arms, waiting next to the door. When the bell struck, pain lanced their legs, the same spot, the same deep ache, so sudden they staggered. Fidel wore the bafflement of a man who has seen much and believes none of it as he saw his guests sink almost to the floor. Across the courtyard, in the tower's arched mouth, figures slid forth like a cuckoo's cousins. A golden assassin and a soldier facing each other. Giovanni's memory, jarred by the gleam, caught a flicker from Lausanne. Statues like these, moving on rails through a dream. He sat and poorly sketched while he still could. Up in the tower's throat, Rose and Claudia, already on the narrow, uneven stairs, heard the chime roll through the stone. The mechanical clanking that followed was both promise and threat. The climb demanded breath and attention, their legs cramped in complaint. The stairs narrowed, pitched, then kinked into a ladder capped by a trap. Rose, wincing from the bruise on her face, worked the lock by the thinnest margin of success. The panel gave with a sigh, and cold air poured down like water. Below, Fidele and his guests returned, anxiety sharpening his voice. The lock of the clock tower had been opened. He uttered the word police. Marsh drew him aside, spoke of the little orphans gone astray and the need to find them with the imminent storm above their heads. Between the doctor's steady eyes and the sky's angry insistence, the old man relented. He would look for the little rascals he had chased earlier. Above, Rose and Claudia stepped into the works. Cogs and wheels and ratchets stacked in a frenzy of engineering, each tooth waiting for its moment to declare itself. You could not walk so much as navigate, a dance of ducking, turning sideways, pausing to let a gear gnash air an inch from your coat. The figures stood ready on their tracks, the Turk, the assassin, the lion, the lad, the lass, Death, the soldier, the angel, Time's little congregation. Claudia closed her eyes and let the feeling wash over her. Something about the Turk, Death, the lass and the soldier snagged at her nerves. She opened her eyes with a decision. They would test her instincts. The occultist started by examining the lass, but the automaton's leg was of simple ceramic. 15 minutes drifted by in oil scent and the faint hiss of ropes. The quarter chime pricked Claudia and Rose with a tiny arrow of pain in the left leg. Somewhere the bell of the clock tower sent out a wave, and if one were credulous, you could imagine it rolling through the city, turning heads and hearts. The whirring thickened, doors in the tower's face unlatched. The figures began to move, pushing and jostling the investigators as a crowd might in a station. Claudia dashed forward, trusting her body to know where the gears weren't. Rose, a half step slower, took a solid glancing blow to the back of the head, a sickly starburst of pain that left her swallowing bile. Claudia and Rose were soon joined by Giovanni, Marsh and Leopold, who had left Fidele to his own devices. As the chime trembled the air, Rose saw a hooded silhouette beyond the figure, gaunt jaws and a wide grin cut in darkness like slits.
He's here,
she whispered, dry-mouthed. The thing, if it had been a thing and not a shadow, seemed to notice the noticing and slipped back into whatever fold it had issued from. Rose pressed a palm to the wall until the shiver passed. The cycle shifted, Turk and Lion took their places. The automatons of Death and the Turk hid nothing from Claudia, who had recruited Leopold, in scouring the mannequins. By elimination, it had to be the soldier. A hard-won insight spasmed through Giovanni. At each chime, the bell pushed a malaise across the city. The statues were not mere spectacle, but conductors in a strange symphony. He climbed to the bell further behind and found symbols scribed into its inner lip. He spat on a handkerchief and scrubbed until his fingers ached. The clock rolled forward to the confrontation. The soldier and the assassin slid into their eternal standoff. The tower shuddered with their approach. Everything became timing and luck, the thin line between stepping and being struck. Rose moved to clear a path and caught a brutal blow that doubled her, breath gone. She gagged and forced herself upright. Marsh's hands were strong on her arm, the small anchoring pressure that said, "Not yet." When the bell sang this time, they felt nothing in their arms, a hollow where pain had been. Giovanni's scrubbing had peeled something from the mechanism, unspelled a small cruelty. Hope, like a match, flared. They had another 15 minutes. A thin, uncanny shimmer, blue as a vein, winked across the soldier's leg when Claudia and Leopold pressed near, searching for the source of the resonance she had felt. The Belgian and the American pulled on the leg that came loose with an audible pop. Leopold wrapped it up and held it close, pain now throbbing through his left leg. Then the tower groaned with hatred, gears shook loose, jagged ratchets spat themselves from their housings. The whole assembly shuddered into a frenzy. Around the investigators, beside them, ahead and behind, the figures leapt into deranged life, flinging themselves along their rails, weapons raised in mindless fidelity to some long-ago drama. The room filled with clatter and the smell of heated metal. Faces, painted smiles, bronze sneers, eyes that did not blink, lunged and withdrew, a nightmare procession wound too tight. The assassin's blade skated sparks from a railing. The lion's maw clacked like a hinge closing on flesh. The angel's wings beat the cold air into colder shapes. Leopold, quaking despite himself, clutched his parcel tight, the leg, the dreadful, necessary leg. The others drew around him as if he were a flame in a storm. They ran, ducked when ducking would suffice, and trusted their feet to find the negative spaces between teeth. Freed from its housing, the loosened leg had broken the delicate balance of the clockwork. The automatons, deprived of their symmetry, grew wilder. Claudia and Leopold ducked as the assassin's blade whistled inches above their heads. Claudia slid low beneath a swinging brass limb, her coat trailing sparks where metal kissed fabric. The movement so clean it seemed choreographed. Rose stumbled, nearly struck again as a flailing arm clipped her shoulder with numbing force. The floor trembled as cogs tore loose from their moorings. Marsh shouted something, lost in the roar, and Giovanni threw himself toward the hatch, wrenching it open with a grunt. The investigators half fell, half glided through the narrow opening, scraping knuckles and boots against the iron edge. Then came the bell. It tore free with a shriek of metal, tumbling through the air like the judgment of heaven. The sound was beyond hearing, felt more in the chest than the ears. It crashed through the beams, shearing a plank inches from Claudia's head before plunging into the darkness below. For a heartbeat, the entire tower swayed as if deciding whether to collapse. Somehow it held. When they staggered out into the square, Nonno Fidele was there, broom in hand, face grey with fright. His eyes darted from their torn coats to the trembling tower. "I will call the police," he said, voice thin and urgent, more plea than threat. Claudia, still catching her breath, met his gaze and shook her head.
No, please. Wait. Just wait a while before doing it.
There must have been something in her tone, something tired and final, for he nodded slowly and clutched his broom like a cross. They did not linger. The rain had begun again, sharp and cold, sweeping the alleys clean of witnesses. They packed quickly at the hotel, wordless in their exhaustion. By the time the Orient Express hissed in the station, its lamps haloed by steam, they had become only shadows carrying luggage heavier than before. They boarded in silence. The train shuddered and rolled out into the dead of night, heading east toward Trieste. In Leopold's berth, they gathered, the compartment lit by a single dim bulb that trembled with each turn of the wheels. The leg, now wrapped and bound in heavy cloth, lay across the berth like a sleeping thing. As they worked to conceal it properly within a trunk, a prickle ran across the back of their necks, that primal sense of being watched. In the reflected glass of the window, something spider-like seemed to stir. A trick of light, perhaps, or something crouched just beyond the edge of understanding. None of them spoke of it. Sleep was impossible. The rhythm of the train became a dull heartbeat that kept their eyes open. Giovanni, restless, reached into his satchel and drew out a volume bound in dark, cracking leather. The priest invited each of his friends to follow him. They huddled up in the empty dining car.
"I came across this in Venice,"
he said quietly.
"The Devil's Simulacrum. It is an illuminated manuscript,
Giovanni continued,
Written in Latin by an anonymous Cistercian monk, probably around 1260, and based on earlier material by monks and crusaders who were in Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade. An Italian craftsman bound it into a single volume, his imprint and the date remain in the flyleaf. The text seems to tell a continuous narrative concerning the sack of Constantinople. It is beautifully illuminated, I must say. There are lovely depictions of a curved scimitar with a serpent's head for a pommel, and a suit of armor that seems to have two faces, one looking forward, one looking back.
All listened to Giovanni, the rattle of the rails merging with the cadence of his voice. Outside, night pressed against the glass. Inside, history pressed closer still,